Greetings and welcome back to room 303, the Harvard Classics Lectures. This is lecture number 87. We're now going to look at Edmund Burke's classic offering, Reflections on the French Revolution. In this volume, however, we also will have the aesthetic theory of Edmund Burke, On Taste, his 1757, and On the Sublime and Beautiful, also from this same year, 57. His aesthetics theory. But of course, the real reason why we study Burke, we need to study Burke, is the enlightened conservatism, as it later will be referred to as, from Reflections on the French Revolution of 1790. There's also in this volume his classic letter to a noble lord from 1796, right before he died, which is just some brilliant prose as well. Now, it is interesting. When you look at Dr. Eliot and his selection, as we've said many times in our lectures here at learnstrong.net, down that left-hand side you can find the Harvard Classics folder, and you can see that our previous 86 lectures, we have said repeatedly that it's always fascinating when people select certain kinds of titles to be representative of whatever philosophy or philosophic or educational ideology or ideologies are to be represented. The titles that are selected, the titles that are not selected, the names on authors that are selected versus the names and authors that are not. And it's interesting that Burke will get a whole volume here. We don't have a volume for Rousseau or for Voltaire or for Immanuel Kant in the Harvard Classics, but we do have for Burke, which is fascinating because he's often not really considered one of the greatest of the philosophers. Certainly Hume is considered a greater philosopher. But in regards to political theory, we have to pay homage to some degree to the ideas of Burke. Whether we agree or disagree with his fundamental conservatism, we still, I think, have to pay attention to the ideas of Burke. So we'll be looking at them now. No question, Burke is considered one of the great fathers of conservatism, and we're going to investigate as to why. I think today this notion of calling oneself either a liberal or a conservative is laden with all kinds of pejorative or negative implications. For Burke, we're going to find the roots of a certain kind of idea that will be significantly important in our study from Plato through the Enlightenment and then ultimately to post-modernity. Burke's biography, briefly, he is born in Ireland, Dublin, in 1729. He will die in England in 1797. He does serve in Parliament from 1766 to 1794 in the Whig Party and Rottingham Whig. And it is true that we have to couch everything that we'll say about Burke from that perspective. He's very influenced by the skeptical empiricism of Hume. He's a practical politician. In other words, he's very interested in the question, what works? He was a reform-minded Whig. It's interesting that he supports the American colonists in their call for proper representation, but he does not support the French in their revolution. He emphasizes empiricism over rationalism, and to that degree he's fundamentally often a skeptic. You could make the argument that the early conservative thinkers were fundamentally skeptical in large ways about what can actually work. That is to say, he's very concerned about risk as it relates to reform. This will be at the heart of his views of the French Revolution. However, he's not a reactionary. That is to say, he's not against all governmental change, not at all. He's just what we would call conservative. That is to say, he wants to see reforms made, but with, now his P word is prudence, and that's the key word when you pick up Burke and you read him. You'll remember in our lecture on Thomas Jefferson and the Declaration of Independence, prudence indeed long dictates that nations so blah, 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 blah. That word prudence is a central word to understanding the political thinking of Burke. That is to say, let's be careful. Or for those of you who love Pete Jackson's Lord of the Rings trilogy, not too hasty, not too hasty. That notion of let's pay attention to what could happen, both positive and negatively, to any kind of political change or reform. Now let's just work through the titles, giving the majority of our time here to, of course, on the French Revolution. I'll begin first of all with On Taste and On the Sublime and Beautiful from 1757. Here, we're going to seek Burke for grounded or for common principles that would be germane to all human beings. And he's going to argue that, in fact, in aesthetic theory, this kind of thing can, in fact, happen. He will argue that the beautiful is that which is well-formed and aesthetically pleasing, while the sublime is that which has power to compel and to destroy us. In some ways here, we will see the birth of the movement from neoclassicism to romanticism. You can go back and look at my lectures on Blake and on the other important romantic writers of the day. Lord Byron comes to mind when we think about that notion of a sublime terror. Kant was influenced by this essay, and to that degree, we want to pay attention to at least some of the lines. I'll just dip into a few lines here just to give you a sense of the language of Burke here in his philosophic treatment. He will say, near the end of part one, this. He says, we might expect that the artists themselves would have been our surest guides, but the artists have been too much occupied in the practice. The philosophers have done little, and what they had done was mostly with a view to their own schemes and systems. And as for those called critics, they have generally sought the rule of the arts in the wrong place. They sought it among poems, pictures, engravings, statues, and buildings. But art can never give the rules that make an art. This is, I believe, the reason why artists in general, and poets principally, have been confined to so narrow a circle. They have been rather imitators of one another than of nature, and this was so faithful an uniformity and to so remote an antiquity that it's hard to say who gave the first model. In part two, he will say it this way, which is a continuation of some of his ideas on what it is that makes the sublime and the beautiful. In his section on infinity, he says it this way. And this just brilliant prose. I mean, enjoy the poetic prose of Burke. Another source of the sublime is infinity. If it does not rather belong to the last, infinity has a tendency to fill the mind with that sort of delightful horror. This will come almost remind us of Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, Lord Byron's. I've given a lecture on that at Rimstrong as well, which is the most genuine effect and truest test of the sublime. There are scarce any things which can become the objects of our senses that are really and in their own nature infinite. But the eye, not being able to perceive the bounds of many things, they seem to be infinite, and they produce the same effects as if they were really so. We are deceived in the like manner in the parts of some large object are so continued to an indefinite number that the imagination meets no check which may hinder its extending them pleasure. He will continue. I'll give you another set of comments here from part two as well. On women, which will tell us that this is in fact, Burke, a book written by a man for men. He says it this way. He says, I need, here says, by the way, in the section on delicacy, he says it this way, I need here say little of the fair sex, where I believe the point will be easily allowed me. The beauty of women is considerably owing to their weakness or delicacy, and is even enhanced by their timidity, a quality of mind analogous to it. Having raised two daughters myself, of course, I can see the eye rolling already. Again, we want to critique Burke, no question, and we will do as much. But we have to see him as a product of his time as well. No question about that. Let's now turn to his reflections on the Revolution in France, which is where we will spend the majority of our time. And quite frankly, what I want to do is I want to let Burke speak for himself. I mean, I wish I could just read the whole essay to you. I know some of you are smiling because I say that often. I would love to read the whole thing to you, and then we can exegete as we go. We just don't have time. So we're going to let Burke do his own talking here. What are his thoughts about the Revolution in France? Let's begin, first of all, with the full title, okay? It is a mouthful. Reflections on the Revolution in France and on the proceedings in certain societies in London relative to that event, in a letter intended to have been sent to a gentleman in Paris, 1790. This is the intro materials. I'll just read them from Harvard Classics because it's so great. The characteristic passion of Burke's life was his love of order. If you're taking notes, that's where you want to begin with Burke. He loves order. We'll get to several lines that demonstrate this. In spite of the varying relations held by him toward the different parties in England during his political career, one may easily find a key to his consistency in this central principle. When the King's party sought to increase the royal pejorative, he resisted. When the old Whigs sought to make the government of the country a means to the enrichment of their class, he resisted. And when the sympathizers with the revolution sought, as Burke thought, to abolish government, he resisted. Liberty he claimed that he loved, but, quote, a liberty connected with order, end quote. And in each of the political movements just mentioned, he discerned an attack on either liberty or order. He had a profound veneration of the accumulated wisdom of centuries of experience and held that the bounds of liberty should be enlarged with great caution and very gradually. That line is central to understanding Burke's conservatism. That a political system had lasted a long time was to him an argument that it must, to a large extent, be fit for its purpose, and that therefore it should not be rashly changed. With such views, Burke was bound to oppose the French Revolution. The sweeping away of the traditions of ages, the erection of new forms of government built on abstract theories, were abhorrent to him, and he threw himself with vehemence into opposition. Much that was hopeful in the revolution he failed to see, and he could not in his passion discriminate carefully among men and motives, but his treatment of the situation in these reflections, written before the terror had begun to alienate sympathy, shows great insight and prophetic wisdom. He does in many ways prophesy the rise of Napoleon. Of course, we could argue Plato does the same in Book 8 of Republic, right? This book led the reaction in England and made its author a European figure. In this country today, that is to say America, and we're speaking now in 1909, with our traditional sympathy with the great upheaval, it is in the highest degree valuable to see these momentous events through the eyes of a great contemporary conservative. And I agree with what Dr. Eliot has written here. I think it is important. Now, obviously, the conservative position that Burke will hold, this prudence position, will obviously lead to the question, how are you ever going to get rid of slavery if this is your approach? How are you ever going to provide equal rights for women and other minorities? Obviously an important question. But we want to make sure that we understand Burke's arguments about the French Revolution and, by extension, then all radical kinds of ideas, politically speaking. And with that regards, let's let Burke speak for himself. I'm just going to dip now into the letter, it's called, although it's an awfully long letter, right? And just get a sense of the language of Burke. He says very early on in the letter, as he's writing to this young man who wants to know about, the French Revolution. What are your thoughts about the French Revolution? The young man being French and obviously very excited about what's going on. Burke says it this way: I flatter myself that I love a manly, moral, regulated liberty, as well as any gentleman of that society, be he who will. And perhaps I've given as good proofs of my attachment to that cause in the whole course of my public conduct. I think I envy liberty as little as they do to any other nation, but I cannot stand forward and give praise or blame to anything which relates to human actions and human concerns on a simple view of the object as it stands stripped of every relation in all the nakedness and solitude of metaphysical abstraction. In other words, question, does it work, right? Just a few lines later, he'll begin to speak about prudence. We mentioned this. Let's hear what he has to say. He says, I must be tolerably sure before I venture publicly to congratulate men upon a blessing that they have really received one. Flattery corrupts both the receiver and the giver, and adulation is not of more service to the people than to kings. I should therefore suspend my congratulations to the new liberty of France until I was informed how it had been combined with government, with public force, with the discipline and obedience of armies, with the collection of an effective and well-distributed revenue. By the way, this is the listing. He's going to go through all of these in order. It's a wonderful kind of outlining early on. You want to be, what do we always say in 303? You want to be a good writer? Be a good reader. Here we go. What is good writing? Here, we'll take a look at it, right? With morality and religion, he's going to talk a lot about those things. With the solidarity of property, with peace and order, with civil and social manners, all these in their way are good things too. And without them, liberty is not a benefit whilst it lasts and is not likely to continue long. The effect of liberty to individuals is that they may do what they please. We ought to see what it will please them to do before we risk congratulations which may be soon turned into complaints. Prudence, and then he uses this word, prudence would dictate this in the sense of separate, insulated private men. But liberty men act in bodies, is power. Considerate people, before they declare themselves, will observe the use which is made of power, and particularly of so trying a thing as new power in new persons, of which principles, tempers, and dispositions they have little or no experience, and in situations where those who appear the most stirring in the sense may possibly not be the real movers. Well, this is, of course, a challenge, right, obviously, but I think it's an important one to say, before we start making assumptions, let's pay attention to the effects. He says a little bit later, a state without the means of some change is without the means of its conservation. I mean, just listen to that line again. A state without the means of some change is without the means of its conservation. In other words, you got to be able to change or you will not last. He continues, without such means, it might even risk the loss of that part of the Constitution which it wished the most religiously to preserve. The two principles of conservation and correction, we would say today maybe change, operated strongly at the two critical periods of the Restoration and Revolution, when England found itself without a king. And what he'll do then is he'll look back into English history to make some observations about this tension that will be so significant. A few lines later, he will make an observation specifically about England, and obviously this is a great patriotic text for English readers. The people of England will not ape the fashions they have never tried, nor go back to those which they have found mischievous on trial. They look upon the legal hereditary succession of their crown as among their rights, not as among their wrongs, as a benefit, not as a grievance, as a security for their liberty, not as a badge of servitude. By the way, notice the trinities of that not kind of thing, right? We pointed out rhetorically the power of that kind of writing. There is, of course, a reliance upon the notion of the importance of tradition and the ability to celebrate the traditions while at the same time possibly leaving some of those traditions. He says it this way, this policy appears to me to be the result of profound reflection, or rather the happy effect of following nature, which is wisdom without reflection and above it. A spirit of innovation is generally the result of a selfish temper and confined views. People will not look forward to posterity who never look backward to their ancestors. Now, I'm going to read that line again because I think it's a crucial one to understanding Burke. People will not look forward to posterity, the future and hopeful future, who never look backward to their ancestors. We have to know where we come from intellectually to move forward. This is a profound observation, and obviously one in 303 that we share and propagate. This is why we read the great stories. Remember what we've always said. You are the stories you're told, and the stories that you retell. You're also the stories that you reject, no question. But before you can reject a story, you have to know that story. He continues, besides, the people of England well know that the idea of inheritance furnishes a sure principle of conservation and a sure principle of transmission, without at all excluding a principle of improvement. It leaves acquisition free, but it secures what it acquires. Whatever advantages are obtained by a state proceeding on these maxims are locked fast in a sort of family settlement. Well, I think obviously we have some idealism at play here, but this is also the celebration of Burke, that he is willing to hold to certain ideas of tradition that he considers to be important. He will call a little bit later, just a few lines later, a noble freedom, and this is the way he says it. All your sophistors, he uses, of course, the Platonist notion of being able to use language to prove anything it wants. All your sophistors cannot produce anything better adapted to preserve a rational and manly freedom than the course that we have pursued, who have chosen our nature rather than our speculations, our breasts rather than our inventions, for the great conservatories and magazines of our rights and privileges. In other words, no, we're not interested in going crazy here in England the way you people did there in France. A few lines later, he'll speak about what is unnatural. The rest, he says, is in order. This was unnatural, he says. The rest is in order. They have found their punishment in their success. This is some amazing prose. Listen to this. Laws overturned. I mean, what is wrong with what's going on in France with mob rule? That is to say, no longer recourse to the old traditions. Well, let's listen. Laws overturned, tribunals subverted, industry without vigor, commerce expiring, the revenue unpaid, yet the people impoverished, a church pillaged, and a state not relieved, civil and military anarchy made the constitution of the kingdom. Everything human and divine sacrificed to the idol of public credit, and national bankruptcy the consequence. And to crown all, the paper securities of new, precarious, tottering power, the discredited paper securities of impoverished fraud and beguarded rapine, held out as a currency for the support of an empire in lieu of the two great recognized species that represent the lasting conventional credit of mankind, which disappeared and hid themselves in the earth from whence they came. When the principle of property, whose creatures and representatives they are, was systematically subverted. And then he asks, were all these dreadful things necessary? Again, this is all about pragmaticism, right? Pragmatic understanding of politics. Did it work? And obviously, much of what we would argue about the French Revolution would argue that no, it didn't work, right? A number of paragraphs later, he will ask about chivalry, and in a line that is now, going to be quoted after the fact, long after the fact. We've even said this in our lecture on King Arthur and the chivalric code. He says it this way: "But the age of chivalry is gone. That of sophisters, economists, and calculators has succeeded." It's amazing how sometimes reading old words sounds so remarkably modern, or postmodern, or both postmodern. "The glory of Europe is extinguished forever. Never, never more shall